This is lesson 22-1, Taming the City. How did urban life change in the 19th century? College Board topic 6.9 is called Institutional Responses and Reform. Explain how and why government and other institutions responded to challenges resulting from industrialization. Liberalism shifted from laissez-faire to interventionist economic and social practices in response to the challenges of industrialization. Reforms transformed unhealthy and overcrowded cities by modernizing infrastructure, regulating public health, reforming prisons, and establishing modern police forces. It's those first two that we're really going to concentrate on. The reforms were enacted by governments motivated by such forces as public opinion, prominent individuals, and charity organizations. The place is Great Britain and France, and the time frame is about 1814 to 1871. Key concepts of taming the city: utilitarianism, we're going back to that a little bit, Bacterial Revolution, the Modernization of Paris, the Poor Laws of 1834, and Germ Theory. Key people of Taming the City: Edwin Chadwick, Robert Koch, Joseph Lister, Napoleon III, George Haussmann, he has a German name but he's French, and Louis Pasteur. Let's get some perspective. On what day of the week does the city pick up your trash? And is that just a service? Is that just about sanitation? Is that just about preventing disease? Or is there more to it? Does your city government know something that the average citizen does not? Are parks and open spaces just for people to enjoy? Is it just because the city wants to do something nice? Or is it because of some citizen's desire to give back? Or is there something deeper going on? Is public transportation just to help people get around? Is public transportation a moneymaker for the city? Or is there more to it? Is sewage treatment just about the environment or the water supply? Or is there an underlying reason for all of these things that the average citizen does not necessarily see or think about? Cities were horrible places to live for centuries. They were crowded, they were filthy, they were smelly, they were dangerously unhealthy. The Industrial Revolution made all of that even worse. Improving it took many different people: government leaders and city planners, reformers, scientists, civic citizens. How was city life before the Industrial Revolution? There was massive overcrowding, there was pervasive poverty, there was a severe lack of medical knowledge, there was no public transportation. When people have to walk to places, they have to live much closer together, and disease spreads more quickly that way. Cities had more deaths than births. Populations were simply sustained by the arrival of newcomers. The arrival of the Industrial Revolution. The steam engine made it more practical for factories to be located in the city because a steam engine is footloose. You can put one anywhere. It doesn't have to be near a river. Cities had more workers. Cities had more access to roads. Cities had more supplies. Cities had more raw materials. Related factories were nearby. For example, if your factory uses something made in another factory for its production process, or you sell to other factories something that you produce in your factory, you want to be near them. Urban population was growing quickly throughout the 19th century. For example, in England, it was 17% urban in 1804, but 35% urban in 1851, it had doubled, and 54% urban in 1891. And a typical city used every square inch for living space. There were almost no parks. Houses were narrow and attached to each other. There were no yards. There were open drains and sewers in the city, and they flowed alongside or down the middle of streets. Streets were unpaved. Toilets were primitive and inadequate. Multiple families had to share one toilet, and these toilets were infrequently emptied. Descriptions from this time are too gross to go into here. Soot from the factories and the trains covered everything, even the trees. Rivers like the Thames were way too polluted to drink from or swim in. What were the causes? of so much uncleanliness and death. There was no public transportation. Governments were slow to respond to these issues. There were no sanitary standards. There were no building codes. The science wasn't there. There was no germ theory. Nobody knew the social causes of urban crowding. Some elites were opposed to government taking responsibility. The attitude towards dirt and filth carried over from rural life. People in the coal mines and in the country, they were always dirty. They didn't get sick and die. So it can't be the dirt, right? People had no idea that urban dirt had way more bacteria in it than rural dirt. And people tended to have a fatalistic attitude about sickness and death anyway. It is what it is. You can't do anything about it. The public health movement. It all began with Edwin Chadwick. He was a commissioner for the relief of paupers, and he worked for the Poor Law Commission under the Poor Laws of 1834. And this was an act designed to spend less money on the poor, actually. He was inspired by a school of thought that we're familiar with already called utilitarianism. This had been started by Jeremy Bentham, whom we've studied, and it had been continued by John Stuart Mill. And utilitarianism said, as we know, do the greatest good for the greatest number. Chadwick came up with this theory. If environmental filth causes disease and death, that wasn't known yet, it was just an if. And if disease and death cause poverty, now that was known. Sick people can't work. Orphan children are poor. Then, if the government could clean up the urban environment, there would literally be a lot less poverty. So he started collecting reports from the various poor law offices, and he proved two things. Number one, levels of disease indeed rose with the level of filth in the environment. Remember, people didn't know about germs yet. And number two, the death toll was the result of a lack of three things: drainage, sewage, and garbage collection. Then Edwin Chadwick discovered this, that you could use water to carry waste through pipes at 5% the cost of removing it by hand. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, iron pipes had become cheap, tiled drains had become cheap. And Chadwick's findings caught on all over Europe and the U.S. The number of lives Edwin Chadwick saved over generations can't be counted. All because he was willing to study something as gross as human waste. The Bacterial Revolution. Edwin Chadwick, not knowing about germs, believed that disease came through the nose taking in filth. In the 1840s and 1850s, doctors found that disease was actually linked to drinking water. Louis Pasteur was studying the fermentation process for breweries, and with a microscope, he found these living organisms that were doing the fermentation. And he found that he could control their rate of activity with heat. Pasteur's discovery had important implications. What if certain diseases were caused by certain organisms that you might actually be able to identify? And what if these organisms could actually be controlled? And then came Dr. Robert Koch. He and his team of doctors started developing pure cultures of harmful bacteria. What he did was he identified them and distinguished them by their life cycles. Suddenly, researchers all over the place were copying Koch's techniques and identifying the specific organisms that caused all kinds of diseases. Then came Joseph Lister. Joseph Lister came up with the idea of using an antiseptic over an area to kill germs. The result of all this was twofold. Number one, some of the worst diseases started disappearing. And number two, death rates in the cities started to come down to rural levels. City planning. City planning actually began in Paris, not London, and it began with Louis Napoleon, also known as Napoleon III. He spearheaded a huge public works project to completely redesign Paris. Here are some of the secondary goals of the project: provide employment, improve living conditions in Paris, limit cholera in the city, and testify to the power and glory of France. But as we know, and we've seen this already, Paris had been a nasty cesspool of a place to live and die in for many centuries. Its streets were dark and narrow and labyrinthine. It was poorly planned. It had 1 million people crowded into a small space. It had few open spaces, and residents died like flies. And all of this, as we've already seen several times, made Paris a hotbed of unrest and violent uprisings, which Napoleon III wanted to prevent. Napoleon III put in charge Georges Haussmann. You got to say that French. He was aggressive, he was energetic, he was impatient, and our book, in one of its few attempts to be clever, actually says he bulldozed both buildings and opposition. The modernization of Paris lasted 20 years. The project's activities, it widened and straightened streets, it demolished slums, it created parks and open spaces, it built sewers, it built aqueducts. And Paris served as the model for other cities in Europe to follow in doing the same thing. Public transportation. Planners realized that public transportation prevents disease. If people don't have to walk everywhere they need to go, they don't have to be packed in such a small area. In the 1870s, you had the first horse-drawn carriages, and by the 1890s, you had the electric streetcar. And this was the beginning of suburban community living. There could be better, more spacious housing because of this added transportation. And cities were able to spread out more because of the public transpo. And what was the result of that? People got a lot less sick.